So hello, welcome back, boys and girls. We're still talking about infinite mobilization. And what I find very interesting in that regard are these questions of how to engineer a human body towards an event that is just sprinting. And this is a video where Michael Johnson, you see that here, talks about how you have to engineer yourself to sprint faster than everyone else. And I mean, he won like 4 times gold. You see that here. Now, what I found always fascinating was that sprinting or running in general as a discipline has no external meaning. You don't want to achieve anything. You don't want to get a ball into a goal. You don't have a goal of the game except for running faster. And then I always heard the idea of a competition, that you compete in a race with somebody else. And I'm sure there is something to it, but I was like, when you run 100 meters, you just should run as fast as you can, right? So why does it matter that somebody else is there? I'm sure that I don't understand the complete extent of that, but for me, this becomes now an expression for what Sloterdijk calls this infinite mobilization. And this is what we want to talk further about. So this is actually movement per se. Movement, as he uses that for the Marxist term, let me just look that up. Movement as such, movement sans phrase. Yeah, so work as such, movement sans phrase. And of course, last time we talked about Marx and how he sees everything as a product of production, right? And how we become more economically. And Sloterdijk says, no, you overlook something, right? You overlook that the more grounding primary reason for that is movement itself. And he criticizes Marx that he uses confusing schemes of primary and secondary movement, base and superstructure. And that was always also the question that I remember, like the so-called ideological problem. How do you recognize the superstructure if you're part of a base structure? How can you get through the base structure? And Sloterdijk does not go into these ideological battles and just says, well, let's just not discuss it in terms of ideology. Let's just look at the pure movement that is in it, a non-metaphysical stance on it, if you will, because there is no essence except movement itself, which is a very postmodern thought. And of course, Sloterdijk does not say that we have arrived in postmodernity, that we can really understand it. He says, no. In order to understand that, you have to go through modernity in itself. In reality, the capital process would never have begun if it had not been sustained by independent, parallel, and preceding structures of self-actualization and self-intensification. That is what he talks about, and it is about the primitive accumulation of a kinetic energy, which, always mediated by subjective initiatives, repels itself from the world as first nature, turning it into pure raw material, energy source and substrate, which is then used by kinetic energy to construct a new world from mobile artifacts on top of it. So here he actually describes how he understands the capitalist revolution in his terms of kinetic energy, right? And it comes first from the world of nature, where we turn something into pure raw material as an energy source, produce it as a substrate, and then use it for the new world, just for moving more. So, and then the interesting thing is that he says, okay, where does that actually come from? And he says, well, the classical Greeks, they had a prelude to it, and it was called the Olympic Games, a cult-like intensification of physical exercise. And in that regard, I also have another interesting video of the Olympic Games. And what is to me interesting is that these Olympic Games are always, since I believe 1984, they had this motto of faster, higher, stronger. And this is an interesting motive where we just say, well, aren't there limits to the physical body? And we see where the journey is already gone. And this year was a gymnastic event. Forgive me, I don't know her name. I believe she's Russian. I'm a little bit badly informed on that, to be honest. But I remember that it was very often discussed because she had about 20 seconds and she gave like the first perfect performance in gymnastics, as you can see here. And I know that it's still referenced, so I think it was never repeated in the same sense. It was just perfect. I mean, look at it. And a perfect landing. And she was the first athlete in gymnastics, and I think the only athlete that got a 10 out of 10, right? So this is an interesting video, and you wonder, okay, if we have that, where do we go? Well, Sloterdijk analyzes further, and he says, well, we have then the medievals, and somehow we forget that, right? The medieval is, it is only underground that the energies continue to rumble, having been exhausted in tribal feuds, migrations of people, Hunnish wars, Saxon slaughters, Germanic missions, politics of the First Reich, agriculture, livestock farming, monastic immersion, hermitage, and simple reproduction. So nothing happens except a rumbling. But then the great initial spark happens, as he notes. It seems to begin in the monasteries of the High Middle Ages, where the two factories of primitive accumulation of subjectivity are to be found. So we go to the monarchies, right, to the clustrums, and something is intensified there. What is deployed here in the religious exercise of ascetic self-intensification, autogenetic movement to increase movement. So self-producing movement, which goal it is only to produce more movement. Concentrating on concentration, immersing oneself in immersion, praying for work, working at being able to pray, has its analog in the various sectoral movements towards increasing self-powering mobility. In the accumulation of scientific knowledge, which can only retain its status as valid knowledge if it is organized as research, that is cognitive mobilization. So we mobilize, and we come to a state where we try to mobilize ourselves in different regards. So we have the cognitive mobilization, then we have the self-exaltation of modern territorial states, which then reveal themselves to be transport states that arm themselves in terms of the concept of nations. Then we have, of course, the military mobilization, arms race, battle for ballistic and kinetic advantages. Then we also have the self-dramatization of bodies that goes for the ecstasy of increased movement, entering a cult, self-eroticization, where sexual objects try to increase their sexual performances, and the self-deification of the artist, the intensification of creativity, and so on and so forth. So in all of these cases, we see more and more self-mobilization. And I must say, I also feel that in regards to my work, right? I mean, we try to produce more in order to produce more. What is particularly interesting in that regard are all these podcasts that are focused on productivity, and then just there, I mean, what these people do, they just produce more podcasts on productivity. And then people read these podcasts on productivity, and their job is to write more books on how to be more productive. Yeah, this is an own bubble where people are just dedicated to the question of productivity, while this productivity is just dedicated to producing more contents of the question of productivity. It's absurd in my mind. So it's movement towards more movement that pushes through the industrial and monetary processes, as well with an irresistibility that's sui generis. I think a generation in itself, right? Maybe I have a wrong translation, so correct me if I'm wrong here. We have all these effects of acceleration And then Sloterdijk finally calls this a mobility as such. And you see, we came from Marx's idea of work as such, work sans phrase, and now he translates that into mobility as such, self-movement, sans phrase, a third industrial revolution. Okay, that is what I wanted to say for today. It's interesting with regard to these contents at Olympic Games. It is an interesting metaphor in order to understand our world. Of course, Sloterdijk goes beyond that and develops other topics. He sees quite a return of religion in these ideas of self-intensification. So later he does not talk only about mobility anymore, but in 2012 he published a book, or was it 2008 maybe? I may be confused here something. A book that was called You Must Change Your Life. And the way you change is probably for further change. But I don't want to go deeper into that. My recommendation of Sloterdijk is really the book You Must Change Your Life. I think it's one of his greatest books. I haven't finished this book yet. You see, I'm just on page 18. But yeah, Sloterdijk is definitely a recommendation in general. He always has something interesting to say. I think he's the most interesting thinker in the world. So if you think this was interesting for you, then I suggest that you subscribe or give me at least a like or leave a comment. Again, I don't claim to be an absolute expert on that topic, so any comments that propel the content for the sake of propelling itself, then please leave them. Other than that, I can just say, live long. I will link all these stuff, so watch them in order to become more productive, and then you will prosper.